Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be going through steps 1 and 2 of the 5-step process. Okay, so again, there's going to be a specific order you should watch these videos in. Okay, the first one you should be watching is the overview of the 5-step process for revenue recognition video. Then you should watch each step in the correct order, so just sequential order. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so we're starting with steps 1 and 2, then we're going to go through step 3, then we want to look at steps 4 and 5. Okay, we want to look at these in the sequential order with the overview video first, because otherwise they're not going to make a ton of sense if we watch them in just a random order. Okay, so step 1, identify the contract with customers. Okay, what is a contract? Well, it's a spoken or a written agreement that is enforceable by law and creates rights and obligations, right? It basically says you have to do something and I have to do something, okay? And I also have a right to receive something and you have a right to receive something. That would be a contract, right? So companies cannot recognize revenue unless they have a valid contract, okay? To be a valid contract, 5 criteria must be met. Again, do you have to memorize these? No, but it is good to know what the criteria are. The contract has commercial substance. The entity can identify the payment terms for goods and services to be transferred. The parties have approved the contract. Identification of the rights of the parties is established, and then it is probable that the consideration will be collected. Again, we're not going to spend a ton of time here, but just a quick overview of the 5 criteria to be a valid contract for US GAAP. Okay, and when we have to have a valid contract, we have to have a valid contract to recognize revenue. Okay, so that's why it matters whether the contract is valid. Okay, if a contract can be unilaterally terminated by either party without consideration, revenue should not be recorded until at least one party has performed. This is basically saying that if either party can basically just terminate the contract without the other party doing anything, that would be unilaterally terminating, right? So if I say, okay, I just cancel this contract and you have basically no recourse, right? And I also don't have to pay you anything, that's without consideration, right? We shouldn't recognize revenue until someone has done something. Okay, that's basically what that's saying. Okay. Step 2, identify the separate performance obligations. Okay. What is a performance obligation? Well, it is a requirement for a company to provide a good or a service to a customer. Okay. Again, so a performance obligation, as we've talked about in other videos, it's basically just a requirement for a company to provide a good or service to a customer. Okay. So if a company says, if a customer goes into Starbucks and orders a cup of coffee, Starbucks has a requirement, a performance obligation to provide a cup of coffee in exchange for $3 or however much they charge, right? Okay, that's a performance obligation. To determine how many performance obligations exist, companies must determine if a service or product is distinct within the contract. Okay, distinct is the key word here. Distinct means the product can provide a benefit to the customer by itself. Okay, meaning that it doesn't need anything else in addition to that product to provide benefit to the customer. Okay. Additionally, distinct products and services generally have standalone selling prices. Standalone selling prices mean, okay, if I have a bottle of water, it costs $2 for that bottle of water. That's a standalone selling price. It's sold by itself, right? Also, that bottle of water can provide a benefit to the customer by quenching their thirst without anything else, right? So that would be distinct, right? Distinct products and services are not interrelated with another product or service, and they are not interdependent upon other products or services. Okay, again, kind of the same thing with a bottle of water, right? There's no other product or service that is necessarily interrelated or interdependent on quenching someone's thirst, right? If we just have this bottle of water, right, it's a basic example, but it just shows that we don't need anything else. That the bottle of water is not related to anything else, and it's not interdependent on another product or service to provide the value to the customer. Okay. So that's basically what it means to have a separate performance obligation. If these 3 criteria are met, basically we have a separate performance obligation, okay? And that's, again, how you determine how many obligations exist, okay? So let's look at a quick set of examples here. So just get these all on the same page. Okay, we basically got everything there, perfect. Example 1, XYZ company is a retailer that sells shirts, shoes, and other apparel. On March 1st of 2017, Jill bought a pair of shoes for $55 and a shirt for $30. XYZ company has a 30-day return policy, but does not expect Jill to return the shirt or shoes or shirt. Analyze the transaction using the first 2 steps of the 5-step process. Okay, so basically we're just going to look at this transaction using the first 2 steps of the 5-step process, which we just walked through in words. Okay. So step 1, does a contract exist? Well, yes, a contract exists. There's a legally enforceable agreement to buy and sell a pair of shoes and a shirt, okay? And again, we don't need to necessarily go through all these, right? But it is just good to keep in mind that we need to meet these to have a valid contract. Basically, the contract part, most of the time, it's just going to be kind of assumed in the problem that there's a valid contract. We're just going through this just to make sure that we understand what each of these steps are, okay? But again, a lot of times, step one, the reason I'm not spending a ton of time on it is just because a lot of time in the problem, we just literally assume that there is a contract. We don't even worry about that, okay? We're not legal experts here, right? We're accountants, and so we're not worried about step one as much. We just want to be familiar with what it requires, okay? Step two, how many performance obligations are there? There are 2 set performance obligations because the shirt and the shoes are distinct. They have their own selling prices and they're not interdependent or interrelated, right? The shoes and the shirt can be sold by themselves, okay? You don't need the shirt for the shoe to wear the shoes. You don't need the shoes to wear the shirt, right? So they're not interrelated. They're not interdependent on each other. And they can each provide a benefit to the customer by itself, right? I can wear that pair of shoes with a random other shirt. I can wear that shirt with a different pair of shoes, right? And they both have their own standalone selling prices, $55 and $30, okay? Especially that standalone selling price, that's a very, very important criterion for whether or not there's a separate performance obligation. So generally, if we don't have a standalone selling price, we generally do not have a separate performance obligation, okay? And you potentially will see that a lot in the problems, okay? Then we have example 2. ABC company sells customized furniture. On January 1 of 2018, the company sold a table and a chair set to Jimmy for a total of $500. ABC makes the table and chairs using wood, paint, and nails. The chairs cannot be purchased separately from the table, and the table cannot be purchased separately from the chairs. Required to analyze a transaction using the first 2 steps of the 5-step process. Again, does a contract exist? Yes, a contract exists. There's a legally enforceable agreement to sell table and chairs to Jimmy, okay? So we're not worried about that. Again, we do have a contract. It's just kind of common sense for our purposes. And yes, we do, okay? Have a contract. Step 2, how many performance obligations are there? Well, there's only 1 in this case, right? Because the chairs and the table are not distinct. They do not have their own standalone selling prices, and they are interdependent and interrelated, right? We have one price. It's $500 for this total set, and you're not allowed to buy the chairs separately or the table separately, okay? You cannot separate the 2 products. So that means that they are interdependent and interrelated to one another, and they also don't have a selling price by itself, okay? If you could buy them separately, yeah, it would basically be 2 separate performance obligations, but you can't, okay? You have to buy them together, okay? So in this case, we're just gonna have 1 performance obligation because the way ABC has its chairs and tables set up, that you have to buy it together, okay? So that is basically the end of this video. These are not too bad. Step 1, again, is usually pretty straightforward. Step 2 can sometimes be a little confusing. Don't worry a ton if a homework question or whatever says, how many performance obligations are there? And you say it's 2, and then they say it's 3. A lot of times it's debatable about how many performance obligations there are. These examples are very black and white, and on an exam, if it asked you to, on a quiz or exam or whatever, if it said how many performance obligations are you, it will be very black and white, okay? They're not gonna give you something that is gray because then they're gonna have to go back and people are gonna fight with them and it's just gonna be a bad situation for the professor, the TA, okay? So if it were to ask you something like that, it will be very black and white, right? They're not gonna just be like, oh, how many performance obligations are, and people come up with 5 different answers, which all could kind of somewhat be argued, okay? So again, if you were to write down there's 2 performance obligations on one, when the question says there's 1, or that there's 3 or whatever, okay, there sometimes is a little bit of wiggle room because again, this is a standard set by the FASB. It's not necessarily that everyone's gonna interpret it the exact same way, right? These are guidelines to follow, that's what GAP is. But is everyone going to interpret this in the exact same way? No. Also, this is a relatively new standard and still being interpreted, okay? So again, don't get too worried about step 2 if you mess up a little bit. Step 1's pretty straightforward. But yeah, so with that, that's the end of this video, and I hope that was helpful.